Good to see you again. We're going to spend a little time looking at our Bibles and figuring out what Jesus is talking about. Christians always seem to have a contentious relationship with the law. We don't really understand what it's for. We don't really understand what it does. And we're going to hopefully clear up a few of those misconceptions tonight. There's a story in the Gospel of Matthew about a man that comes to Jesus. It's in Matthew chapter 19, verse 16. Just then someone came up and asked him, "Teacher, what good must I do to have eternal life?" "Why do you ask me about what is good?" He said to him. "There's only one who is good. If you want to enter into life, keep the commandments." "Which ones?" he asked him, and Jesus answered, "Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, honor your father and your mother, and love your neighbor as yourself." He said, "I've kept all these." The young man told him, "What do I still lack?" That's always the question, isn't it? What do we still lack? What is there that's missing in my life? What is it that left this young man thinking that he didn't quite measure up? And that's always the problem with law, isn't it? Because there's always some way that we don't quite measure up. And there are some people that wonder why Jesus answered the question in just this particular way. Maybe that's the culture that he grew up in, because the culture there was to keep the law. Because the law was viewed as the measure of what a man was, the measure of what a woman is. It's always our obedience to these things. And obedience is never a bad thing. But I think we have to ask ourselves a different question here, because Jesus came preaching good news, a gospel, which said that there was a way for us to be related to God rightly. And then he turns around and quotes the law to these men. And we wonder, well, just exactly what's going on here. Maybe we need to ask ourselves another question. And that question is going to take us back over to the book of Exodus, chapter 20, when the people were called out of Egypt and into the wilderness to be led into the land. What was this calling for? What was the purpose of it? Maybe we should ask ourselves, what is the law for? Because if it's just a group of rules to keep, we're pretty good at that. Just give us a set of rules, tell us exactly what you want us to do. And we have to ask ourselves at this point, is that what this law was for? Is that what it really was all about? Let's take a look at that. God spoke all these things and said, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of bondage. You will not have any other gods before me." That entire opening stanza is a covenant statement about who we are, about who these people were. And God was telling them, you bear now a unique relationship to all the people on the face of the planet. I've chosen you to carry out this covenant, to do what I want to be done. Well, what's the context of this? Well, the context, if we back it up far enough, is creation. God created a perfect creation, these two perfect people that were there. And everything was correct between them and God. They chose another path. They chose a different path that put them at odds with God. And the whole story of the Bible up to this point is, what is God going to do to restore that? In fact, how is restoration possible? In a larger sense, how is salvation possible? Well, for us to understand that, maybe we need to understand a little bit about the character of God. Because we live in a world, and they lived in a world then where there were hundreds, if not thousands, of gods. And each of those gods had his own individual request. And all of them were based on the idea that he was somehow unhappy or angry at them for not having kept the rules. Well, why don't you give them a better set of rules? Why don't you provide more rules? Why don't you really strictly define everything you want us to do so that in every case we know exactly what we ought to do? Of course, you and I know that when we multiply that, when we make it more strict, it only makes it easier for us to fail. We understand all the different ways we fail. We all understand all the different ways we disobey. What the rich young ruler was asking is there a way that I can get through this morass to actually encounter life? And that's what we want in the long run. We want to have life. We want to have a life that's meaningful. We want to have a life that has a purpose. We want a life that we know is taking us in a healthy and sound and saving direction. And that's what these people were asking for in the wilderness. And actually, let's be clear about this. These people weren't asking for it. God was calling them to it. In fact, if we back up and really begin to understand this, we don't really start off wanting a series of rules. We start off wanting to do what we want to do. We begin by saying, if I can just get my will in all of this, then I'll be happy. And once we begin to understand that, we see the problem there, because there are other people that want what they want, and they are at odds with us. So we need a different set of rules. We need something that's going to lead us into a deeper and more meaningful life. And maybe we need to understand something about the Creator, because these laws, as we read them, were spoken as though they are possible to keep. And yet they were accepted as something that is absolutely too hard to ever be there. We have that relationship with God sometimes as though He's making these rules a little bit too hard, so that if we fail to carry them out, at least we've gotten close to Him. And yet He never gives them as though He expects us to be close. He expects us to do them. And maybe that's the disconnect between us and them, because we live in a world where that's not possible, where something is so broken between us and our Creator that these rules we're trying to keep are absolutely beyond our ability. We don't even understand them in some degree, because Jesus would talk about murder as something that we do when we disrespect a brother or sister, something that we do when we feel bad about them, something that we do when we look at them and treat them with disrespect. Somebody's going to say, that's not murder. Jesus Christ said it was. We need to think about that. We need to think about what He was saying to this young man. He said, there's this law that you now have. And this law is not a definition of all the ways in which you fail. This law is a definition of my character. I mentioned before that we live in a world where there are hundreds, if not thousands, of gods. And each one of those gods has a different set of rules. Each one of those gods has a different way that He wants to be approached. And all of those gods, almost all of them, are angry. They're angry because we're not keeping their rules. And when we don't keep their rules, they don't come to us and say, let's work this out. They come to us and say, I want you to give me something. I want you to give me something that makes you not angry with you anymore. And that almost always turns into sacrifices that we offer. And we see that all through the Old Testament. We see people with different gods, even this God. And they approach God and they say, well, I'll offer Him enough sacrifices. If I come to Him and I throw enough rams and bulls and goats at Him, He will certainly stop being angry with me. And we see something that's paradoxical toward the later stages of the temple in Jerusalem, because they were bringing sacrifices every single day. More sacrifices than you and I could ever imagine. And somehow that never seemed to turn this God toward them in any way. In fact, it seemed to do the very same. It turned them away from Him. And when that happened, it wasn't His anger that was really struggling with. It was His disappointment, his sorrow that His people misunderstood Him so much. So let's look at this in a different way. Maybe we need to understand the Creator before we can understand the rules that He gave us. Because when He puts this thing together, He says, I'm the God who set you free. I'm the God who's liberated you. We find echoes of that when we read through the Gospel of John, where Jesus is talking about what the character of God is. And we'll talk about that at a later day. But as we're looking at this in Exodus, He's trying to set them on a path that will lead them to a better life among each other, because the real problem they're having right now in the wilderness is not the ability to get along with God, but the ability to get along with each other. You see all this back and forth, and we'll see it again. All of this jockeying for position, and that's always a part of it if it's all about competition. If it's about me looking better than you so I get a better place. He's trying to make sure that we don't ever get that idea about Him. He says, I'm the one that's in charge. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of bondage. You shall never have any other gods before me. There's only one God. And I want you to worship me. I want you to serve me. I want you to love me. So think about these not so much in terms of demands that God places on us, but ways that God wants to set free His love in our hearts so that it reflects through us into the lives of others. He goes on and says, don't misuse my name. Remember my day. But this other thing here, honor your father and your mother. If we go through all of these commands and we use the word love, not in this simple romantic sense, but in the the sense in which we say, I'm going to do the very best I can for every person that I meet. If we were doing the very best we could for every person that we met, there would never be any trouble in families. Fathers and sons and mothers and daughters would never be cross with each other. Uncles and aunts would never have all these ways of competing. People in societies, instead of being at odds with each other, would be working together in all of this. All of these rules that we're talking about here are really definitions of what it means to have the character of God formed in us, to let His love and His life shine through us. Don't commit adultery. Treat each other with respect. Don't steal. Don't give false testimony. Don't lie. Don't desire what someone else has. All of these laws are reflections of the God of the covenant trying to tell His people, this is what I want you to do. This is what I want you to be. And the story of the Old Testament is the struggle about how that's supposed to be formed in all these people. About not our relationship with God, but our relationships with each other. And in the end, the relationship we have with God is going to be the forgery where all this takes place. It's the forge, it's the way that all of it's shaped in our lives so that we begin to treat the other people around us differently. And so you can see how at some point that becomes profoundly personal, because I can do that on my own, but for it to mean anything, I have to do it in a community. And that's what church is about. Because at one level, we're trying to become more and more like Him. But to do that, we have to get with other people and say, how am I doing this week? We don't really want other people to get inside of us. We don't want to give people that kind of permission in our lives to take a look at us and say, tell me how I'm doing today. We're afraid they might find something in us because we know we can find things in them. The possibility for us treating one another badly is pretty high. But Jesus Christ was willing to risk that because He knew something very important was happening here. The rich young ruler comes to Him and says, I want to know what it means to have life. That was his question. I want to know what it means to have a life that's full and complete with the God I serve and with the people around Him. And Jesus Christ told him, well, you need to keep these commandments. And he said, I've kept all those. I think Jesus Christ was asking him, have you really? Have you really let God that deeply into your life, that deeply into your decision-making process, that deeply into your religious life? Have you really let Him in? We have to ask that every day. It's not a question we ask once a week or once a month or once a year. We ask it every day. And as we begin to ask those questions about ourselves, about the way we treat others, then we find out that there's something that's liberated in us. Okay? Because we begin to see ourselves as we really are, begin to see people around us who they really are. We begin to see the opportunities we have for compassion. I didn't say the opportunities we have for judgment. We're perfectly aware that those are there all the time. This task, this command puts us on the path of compassion. The demand to love, the demand to care for others, the demand to treat them with respect is the one thing that is always incumbent in all of these things. We are called as God's people to live this life in a way that gives Him glory. It's not about us. It's always about Him. And so we find something very simple here. Okay, I'm always able to tell where all the faults in my life are. And I'm pretty good at telling where the faults in your life are. Are we willing to work together on those terms to make our lives better? Are we willing to come into community, to share with each other what God has done for us and how we can be altered by the presence of His grace in us? Because after all, we're not saved by performance. God was not telling them in Exodus chapter 20, you can be saved by performance, because the first relationship He laid down was not their relationship to each other, but their relationship to Him. I'm the one that has brought you into this relationship, and I want you to be rightly related to me. And when that's happened, you'll find yourself right related to your brothers and sisters. We'll find ourselves living in ways that are helpful not only to us and to others, but also to those that we're called, we have a mission to. That life which leads us outside of our bodies, outside of our church, into the community, because the people that we know that are the mission every day are the ones struggling with this. The ones that don't really know about this God that we say that we know. And so as we come to know him, as we come to know each other in a more deep and abiding way, we'll find ourselves able to speak to others about him. So let's go back and do one or two things. Let's look at the law. Let's look at what it really means, because it's really talking to us about what it means to have life. God didn't come to leave these people in the wilderness, to leave them in the desert for 40 years and just bury them there. He intended for them to grow and to mature. And as they moved into that land, to be able to share that with other people, to be able to take it to other people and let them know not only what it looked like, but what it sounded like and what it acted like when it walked by you every day. In Palestine, in the first century, there was a young man that you could find. He was walking down the streets of every dusty city there was. And when people looked at him, they said to themselves, there's something different about him. There's something about him that draws me out of the person I am to the person I want to be. And when he calls me, I'm not always happy about it. But there's an urgency that grasps me, because I think that what he says can be good for us and good for the world I live in, good for the world we live in, the world we're trying to touch every single day. He asked Jesus, what must I do to obtain life? Jesus said, have you tried these? He said, I've kept them all. He says, there's one other thing. Come to me. Give up all the stuff that you think makes your life meaningful. And I'll give you the one thing that makes your life have meaning and purpose.